Okay, we're going to move ahead with our speaker. I think you'll all be pleased with this presentation. In fact, I'm sure you'll all be pleased with this presentation, I should say. Our next speaker is Don Bradley. Don is a writer, editor, and researcher specializing in early Mormon history. Don recently, hold on a second, auction people. Quiet down, please. Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's start again. Don Bradley. Don is a writer, editor, and researcher specializing in early Mormon history. Don recently performed an internship with the Joseph Smith Papers Project and is completing his thesis on the earliest Mormon conceptions of the New Jerusalem toward an MA in history at Utah State University. He's published on the translation of the Book of Mormon, Plural Marriage Before Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith's Grand Fundamental Principles of Mormonism. There's more in his bio. Feel free to look at in the program. And with that, we'd like to welcome Don Bradley. It's right down there. It'll work.
Okay. Alrighty. So, sorry. I know after the presentation earlier today, you're probably wondering if I'm going to be speaking about uncombable hair syndrome, but I'm sorry to disappoint. Last night, I went to the speaker's dinner, and we had a delicious catered meal, and they served something that was very much like chicken cordon bleu. And when I was done with all but 2 bites of mine, I realized with the help of Debbie Peterson that it was mostly raw. And so as I left the speaker's dinner last night, there was some question about whether I was going to be a speaker today. But I'm happy to report that I did not succumb to the effort to food poison me by certain deceased pullets. So here I am. And we'll get going here. Sorry, wrong venue. There we go. Okay. I am delighted to be speaking at FAIR today for a number of reasons, and this isn't something that I would have even just fairly recently anticipated doing. Here's my snazzy title. Joseph Smith's translation from the Kinderhook Plates, A Historical Mystery. Here are the plates, or facsimiles made of them in 1843 in Nauvoo. Most of you probably know the basic story and basic issue, but I'll lay the groundwork for that. So the Kinderhook plates were dug out of a mound in near Kinderhook, Illinois, about 75 miles south of Nauvoo, in the spring of 1843. There were a few men who were doing the digging. There were several onlookers, including 2 Latter-day Saints. And someone had the bright idea soon thereafter of borrowing the plates, ostensibly to show them to neighbors, and they hightailed it to Nauvoo and took them to Joseph Smith for him to examine and presumably to translate from. There we go. Okay. So one of the, Joseph Smith put them on display at his house, and one of the many people who examined them there was Joseph Smith's private clerk, William Clayton. William Clayton is a man whom his biographer, James B. Allen, described as having been probably as much in the last 2 years of Joseph's life, as much in his confidence as anyone. Clayton kept an excellent diary that's our source for a lot of great things about Joseph, but this particular entry is very controversial. I'll just read the part here right now that deals with the Kinderhook plates. I didn't realize I was going to be reading at this kind of funny angle. I'll just read this part right here. President Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain the history of the person with whom they were found, and he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. So far, not necessarily a problem. Joseph Smith is a translator. That's why the plates are brought to him. Problem comes here. when one of the men who dug up the plates, Wilbur Fugit, writes a letter to James T. Cobb, stepson of Brigham Young, who had become alienated from the church in 1879. He says, "I received your letter in regard to those plates and will say in answer they are a humbug, gotten up by Robert Wiley, Bridge Whitton, and myself. We read in Pratt's prophecy that truth would spring up out of the earth. We concluded to prove the prophecy by way of a joke." So he's talking about something that Parley P. Pratt had written. "Bridge Whitton cut them, the plates, out of some pieces of copper. Wiley and I made the hieroglyphics by making impressions on beeswax and filling them with acid and putting it on the plates." So the process he's describing of using acid to burn in these designs is called etching. Etching is relatively modern technology developed in the late 1400s and used for making prints. And this is an example of one of the early prints made through etching in the 1500s. So a good question that arises then were the Kinderhook Plates characters engraved or were they etched? If they were engraved, they could be ancient. If they were etched, as Fugit said, then they could only be modern, and the Kinderhook Plates would have to be a forgery. The plates were tested in the 1970s. Well, a surviving plate that's at the Chicago Historical Society was tested, and it was in fact etched, as Fugit had said, and the alloy also was tested, and it's a modern copper alloy. So the plates were a forgery, bogus. So if the plates were forged, one good question that arises here is, if the plates were forged, who forged them? I think the best answer for that question at present would be Mark Ashurst McGee? Yes, Mark Ashurst McGee. Mark, I don't know if I see him here. Mark is a good friend of mine, I hope still. He is a volume editor with the Joseph Smith papers. Mark has a great interest in the Kinderhook plates, and so much so that several years ago, he sent me an envelope, and in it, there was a note that said, "I dug this up in my backyard, and there was this, a plate." And this is a plate that was cut to the dimensions of the plates that were found in the mound. And Mark actually made this, thus making him perhaps the only living forger of Kinderhook plates. So this is how much Mark really wants to understand the Kinderhook plates, how they were made, and everything about them. So here's a picture of Mark's plate. This is not the real forgery. This is his forged forgery. But Mark, I bring Mark up in particular because he does know so much about the Kinderhook plates, and not only because he forged his own, but just because he's done so much research. And in fact, some of the ideas I'll be drawing on, as I'll mention later today, come from Mark, and he's a collaborator with me on a larger project where this research you'll hear about today will be published. So Latter-day Saints have certainly not been the only people to take an interest in the Kinderhook plates. Critics have taken a particularly keen interest. So here's an anti-Mormon from the 1940s, James D. Bales, who had particularly good rhetorical skills. He put the argument thus: only a bogus prophet translates bogus plates. So there's, of course, apologetic response to this. Stanley Kimball, exactly 30 years ago this month, published an article in which he argued that William Clayton was merely reporting Nauvoo rumor about the plates and didn't have direct information from Joseph, seeing that Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates. The part of the basis, or the primary basis for his reasoning there is this letter, 6 days after Clayton's journal entry from Parley P. Pratt to his cousin John Van Cott, where he talks about the finding of the plates and what he knows about them, what he's heard about them. And, Kimball noted some contradictions between the two. And he reasoned from that they must both be relying on, neither of these men really knows what he's talking about, they're just relying on rumor. So Clayton, you can see there's some overlap and some difference. Clayton says 6 brass plates, Pratt says really the same thing. Clayton says Adams County, Pratt says Pike County. It was Pike County, Adams County is the nearby adjoining county. Clayton says some persons had found them, Pratt says a gentleman. They both say they'd been dug out of a mound. Clayton says 6 feet from the surface. Pratt says 15. Clayton says the skeleton was, they were found with a skeleton which was 9 feet high. Pratt doesn't mention the 9-foot-high skeleton, but there was common folklore at the time about 9-foot-tall people, and I may have an image to go with that. No, not quite. I think that's more like it, but that's I think that would be for a presentation on Cain. So, the plates reportedly contain, from Clayton's report, Joseph had said they contain the history of the person with whom they were found, and he was a descendant of Ham. Pratt says they contain the genealogy of one of the ancient Jaredites back to Ham, the son of Noah. So they both say Ham, and Pratt adds the detail of a Jaredite, which we'll get back to. Clayton says the guy was a descendant through the lines of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Pratt mentions that the engravings were in Egyptian language. They both give it an Egyptian connection. There's our tall people again. So let's compare Clayton and Pratt at a little higher level here. Clayton and Pratt disagree somewhat on the finding of the plates, but we know that neither man was present for that. Necessarily, they're both, primarily where they disagree, it's on the finding of the plates, which we know neither of them was present for, so they're both necessarily going to be relying on what other people tell them. They largely agree on the content of the plates, that they contain the genealogy of a descendant of Ham, whom they connect with Egypt. I don't know why those both popped up. Pratt also says the man was a Jaredite, but he thinks this is compatible with him being a descendant of Ham. So for him, that's not a contradiction. He apparently thinks the Jaredites were descendants of Ham. The argument that if Kimball's argument that if Clayton and Pratt contradict, they're both wrong and relying on rumor is a non sequitur. If you have two people contradict, it means that at least one of them is wrong, but it doesn't follow that they're both wrong or relying on an unreliable source. Clayton's account, therefore, can't be dismissed as rumor just because it only partly agrees with Pratt's. So how much trust should we give to Clayton's account? If we look at his journal entry for the day, how well positioned was he to know Joseph's views on the Kinderhook plates? I'll take each of the items here from the entry that tell what else he was doing that day and look at them specifically. So here he's got this cryptic part of the entry that says at 10 in the morning, it says at 10 MJ to LW. Well, what on earth is that? Well, fortunately, he tells us in an affidavit, I believe 36 years later, or no, 32 years later, or can I count? 31. On the first day of May 1843, I officiated in the office of an elder by marrying Lucy Walker to the prophet Joseph Smith at his own residence. Now, Lucy Walker actually lived at Joseph's house, so that makes sense. But it sounds like they were kind of tight. I mean, I've never sealed a wife to anybody. Seems like kind of a rather intimate thing to do. He says in the afternoon now, he's at President Joseph's house. He is gone out with Woodworth. He uses the present tense verb. He's out now. And where's Clayton? Clayton's at Joseph's. So Clayton has stayed at Joseph's, and Joseph has gone out. And Clayton actually has his journal with him and is writing in his journal at Joseph's house. We'll see further as we keep going. So he says that he borrowed $20 of William Allen. Then I've got the ellipsis there, which is about having supper, which we'll get to. President paid, past tense, $20 to Woodworth for the Nauvoo house. So these refer to things that Joseph had done while he was out. Whoops. So Clayton is, when Joseph comes back, Clayton is still there. And then Joseph goes out and comes back again, and Clayton is updating his journal throughout the day so that he can write, Joseph is out with Woodworth, then he can write, he's borrowed money, he's had supper with me, then he can write, he's taken that money and he's used it to pay Woodworth. So he says, I took supper with him. So he's not only performing an ordinance for Joseph and doing business with him, but also just spending time socializing with him. There's a tracing of the plate that actually appears inside a journal entry. So these plates are, as you saw here, they're just a few inches high. So he actually traces that into the journal entry and writes around it. So Clayton, again, is writing in his journal at Joseph's, where the Kinderhook plates are on display. Clayton's curious about the plates while at Joseph and spends a portion of his day there with different times with Joseph. Clayton likely records his information about the Kinderhook plates, like the rest of this entry, including the tracing and so on, at Joseph's house. We don't know that for sure, but it would make sense. So what does this journal entry show? First, that morning, Clayton sealed the poor wife to Joseph. Second, Clayton was at Joseph's and writing his journal while Joseph went out, returned and went out again. Clayton updated his journal throughout the day. Clayton had supper with Joseph. And then Clayton was curious about the Kinderhook plates while at Joseph's, traced one of the plates into his journal, and maybe even there, but soon thereafter, wrote a good bit in his journal about the plates. So it's in this context that Clayton writes, President Joseph has translated a portion and says they contain what he says they contain. So for Clayton to not know whether Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates, he would have needed to never discuss the matter, even with Joseph directly, about the translation, even though, as Clayton says in later affidavits, he was with Joseph nearly every day. Clayton would have needed to hear rumor that Joseph had translated, and specifically what he had translated, but again, not raise the subject with Joseph. And Clayton would have to be curious enough to write about the Kinderhook plates at length in his journal, in Joseph's house, trace the plate into his journal, listen to the idle rumors going around about it, and record those, but not curious enough to actually ask Joseph about the plates, even when he's closely involved with Joseph that day, and he has the ideal opportunity to ask. The plates are on display at Joseph's house that day. He's at Joseph's house through much of the day. He has supper with him, and so on. So we've got so here's the problem then, that Joseph, according to someone who was well positioned to know this, reportedly translated something from the Kinderhook plates. The Kinderhook plates are a forgery. So Mark came up with the hypothesis that Joseph Smith had translated from the Kinderhook plates not as a prophet, but just as someone who was interested in languages. We know that Joseph studied Hebrew, that he studied Greek, that he studied German. So he could have simply tried to figure out what was on the Kinderhook plates himself. And in support of this, Mark has pointed to Joseph Smith's journal, which was actually kept for him by his secretary, Willard Richards, here under the date of May 7th, so the same day as that Parley Pratt letter. He says, forenoon, morning, was visited by several gentlemen Joseph was visited by several gentlemen concerning the plates, which were dug out of a mound near Quincy, and he sent by William Smith to the office for his Hebrew Bible and lexicon. Now, why a lexicon is a tool for translation? Why is he, if he's got the Kinderhook plates, and if these two things go together, why is he looking at the Kinderhook plates and calling for this foreign language translation tool unless he's trying to use it to figure out what's on the Kinderhook plates? I thought this was a really intriguing hypothesis, but I actually didn't believe it until I found the source that Joseph used to get this content that Clayton reports from the Kinderhook plates. So here's the content and the question: how do you get all of this out of a couple Hebrew characters and a bunch of random squiggles. Mark has looked on the Kinderhook plates and found a few things that could pass for Hebrew characters scattered throughout all these other hundreds of characters. I've looked, and the only thing I can really clearly see is an aleph, so an A, and I don't see how you get this out of that. This document has been talked about here before. This is the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, or a page from it. That was a bound volume of Egyptian alphabet materials that were put together in Kirtland in connection with the translation of the Book of Abraham, and the exact history behind those is itself something of a matter of controversy. They're in the handwriting of Joseph Smith's scribes. Here is, so it's page 4 here. This is actually, though, just the second page of where they have characters listed, like they'll show a character from the papyrus, Book of Abraham related papyrus, then they'll show a name that's assigned to the character, and then a definition. So specifically, down at the very bottom of the page there, we've got this character. They gave the name, this boat-shaped character here, they gave the name Hoi Upa to. And here's the definition given: honor by birth, kingly power by the line of Pharaoh, possession by birth, one who reigns upon his throne universally, possession of heaven and earth, and of the blessings of the earth. Okay. Here, then, let's compare the two. What Clayton says Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates and the definition given for Hoi Upa in the GAEL. So in red there, we've got the idea of kingship. Joseph says, according to Clayton, that the plates say this guy's a king, received his kingdom. In the Hoi Upa definition, we've got kingly power, or one who reigns upon his throne. So in each case, we're talking about a king. In blue there, we've got from the reported translation by Joseph from the Kinderhook plates, a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh. In the GAEL, we've got, for this character, we've got by the line of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is, of course, in the Book of Abraham, described as a descendant of Ham. So if you're a descendant of Pharaoh, you are a descendant of Ham by definition. Then in violet here, we've got from Joseph's reported translation from the Kinderhook plates, the phrase ruler of heaven and earth. And from this definition for the character in the GAEL, we've got possessor of heaven and earth. So if you look at what's in black there, that's what doesn't overlap. So in the first column, you've only got, the only substantive thing you've got is Egypt. And of course, that's implied in being Pharaoh, is that means you're king of Egypt. In the other column, though, for the GAEL character definition, you've got a fair amount of black. So the definition for this character could not be derived simply from what Clayton says Joseph had translated from the Kinderhook plates, but the reverse isn't true. You could derive all the content that Clayton says Joseph gets off the Kinderhook plates from this one definition for a character, single character in the GAEL. So question then would become, well, how exactly do you get this how do you get this material specifically off of the Kinderhook plates? Well, both the Kinderhook plates and the GAEL are covered in characters. So here we've got that particular character, Hoi Upa. You can see it's got this boat shape. And by the way, these images are courtesy of the church historical department, for which I'm very grateful. Oh, shoot, I meant earlier to ask you to look at these and see what stood out to you as like a few of the more prominent, larger or more prominent characters. And then I was going to ask at this point a question to see which you had thought, but a little late. So if you see the second row of plates there, the second plate over, you've got a boat-shaped character there at the top, and you've got really a lot of blank space around it, plus you've got a line on each plate near the top that separates the top characters from the lower characters. But in this case, for that plate, you've got the line going down much lower. And so the top character on that plate has, the top of that plate is more distinctive, and there's more blank space around that top character, and it's a very large, prominent character. So there's the up close on that. So here's that character closer. And to understand how, if Joseph Smith were using the GAEL to examine the Kinderhook plates, to understand how he would have done that, we need to understand something about the system of character analysis used on the GAEL. So here at the top, this is not one of the high-quality images here from the church, but at the top here, you've got a character for which the definition is given Kaya Brom, or a transliteration. And then underneath that, it says, this character shown dissected. And you've got the character broken into its component lines and dots. So the graphemes that make up this character are separated out. And then each of those is treated as a separate character and given assigned its own name, its own definition. So if you were going to use this as a basis for looking at the Kinderhook plates, then this character here from the plates would not be one single character, really. You would break it down, so that top line that cuts through the boat shape would be a single character. That theta-like mark inside would be its own character. And so you'd get something like, now with the miracle of Photoshop, this, and then again with the miracle of Photoshop, here's a positive of that. So here, let's compare the two characters. So you've got, it shows where each here is taken from on its plate or page. And the difference here really is just in the depth of the boat shape, with the Kinderhook plate shape being deeper. Otherwise, it's the same, they've got the same boat shape. So look how simple this would have been. Joseph could have obtained all the content that Clayton says he did from the Kinderhook plates by just matching one of the most prominent characters from the Kinderhook plates and one character from the second page of characters in the GAEL. So this is, I don't know if I mentioned before, but even though this is page 4 of the GAEL, it's only page 2 of listing the actual characters. So the comparison could have been really quick and really simple and just find an aha match. But it gets better. Here we've got New York Herald for May 30th, 1843, which published a letter from someone who signed as a Gentile. Now, looking at the letter and then from other correspondence from this guy to James Gordon Bennett of the Herald, the editor, we find out that he's a friendly non-Mormon who lives in Nauvoo. And so there's the close-up so you can see the date, Nauvoo, Illinois, May 7th, 1843. You'll notice that May 7th is the same date for the Parley P. Pratt letter where he says various people had examined the Kinderhook plates, and the same date for the Joseph Smith journal entry that also says people had come calling on Joseph about the plates. So he says a fair amount about the finding of the plates and so on, but let me read you the crucial part here. The plates are evidently brass and are covered on both sides with hieroglyphics. They were brought up and shown to Joseph Smith. He compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet. Now, the guy's a non-Mormon here, and so he doesn't actually understand what this Egyptian alphabet is. So he says, which he took from the plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. He doesn't know it's from the Book of Abraham. They're from the Book of Abraham papyrus. He says he compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet. They're evidently the same characters. He therefore will be able to decipher them. So let's look here. This is the Alphabet and Grammar volume, and you can see the title on the spine, which has Egyptian alphabet. Now, Robin Jensen of the Joseph Smith papers tells me that we don't know when this label was added. It could have been added in Utah. If it was added early on, then this Gentile would have seen this on the spine and obviously would have called it the Egyptian alphabet. Even if it's a later name that's affixed to it, it shows what the saints actually knew this volume as. They knew it as Egyptian alphabet, and so that's likely the name under which he would have heard of it. So we've now had 3 sources dating to May 7th, 1843. We've had Willard Richards saying Joseph was visited by several gentlemen concerning the plates and sent for his Hebrew Bible and lexicon. Gentleman doesn't seem like the most likely term for him to use if he's talking about his fellow saints. It seems likely he's referring to non-Mormons, and Mark and I are going to be looking into that further, but it looks from a preliminary glance like Richards uses that term for non-Mormons. Pratt says a large number of citizens, and notice again, this doesn't sound like he's talking about fellow saints. This is more general than that. Have seen them and compared the characters with those on the Egyptian papyrus, which is now in this city, and the plates are filled with engravings in Egyptian language. Now, Pratt doesn't say that the Kinderhook Plates characters were compared directly with the Egyptian papyrus. He says that they're compared with the characters that are on the Egyptian papyrus, which are the same characters that are in this GAEL or Egyptian alphabet volume. And now we've got, this will work, okay. This fellow, a Gentile, saying that Joseph Smith compared the Kinderhook Plates in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet, and they're evidently the same characters. He will therefore be able to decipher them. So what can we draw out of this, out of these sources? Joseph Smith was visited, presumably at his house, by several gentlemen or citizens on this day, among whom was likely this guy, a Gentile, and he displayed to them the Kinderhook Plates. And I would also infer from that other things. Joseph wanted to show them the character match he'd found and told Clayton about. So he sent William Smith, not for his Hebrew lexicon, as Willard Richards thought, but for his Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Now, Richards is keeping this journal for Joseph rather than Joseph keeping it himself. If he's not present, he's not necessarily going to know what volume was sent for. He would hear about it from someone else. So I believe that the translation tool that Joseph actually sends for while talking to these gentlemen is the Egyptian alphabet and grammar, as a Gentile says. So what's the significance of this guy's account? The account dovetails perfectly with those by Willard Richards and Parley Pratt in its content and timing. This account indicates that not only that Joseph Smith had compared the Kinderhook Plates characters with those on his Egyptian alphabet, but it also says he found a match. It's evidently the same characters, he said, so he had to have found a match. And this match provided a definition for at least one character, and therefore the means by which Joseph could decipher the plates. So here we've got an eyewitness who is describing Joseph doing what we had just inferred he was doing based on the content of the Clayton journal entry and the content of the GAEL and the match of the characters there. So what conclusions can we draw from all this? This is not really the conclusions we can draw from this. This is a shameless plug for my forthcoming book, The Lost 116 Pages, Discovering the Book of Mormon's Unknown Stories, which I had optimistically thought would be out in September, and I'm now trying to get out in November. But anyway, shameless plug over. So conclusions here. The text that Joseph translated from this portion, what Clayton calls a portion of the Kinderhook Plates, can be derived from a single character. So that portion that he's describing is probably just a single character. Single character definition near the beginning of the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. Substantially the same character appears on the Kinderhook Plates as one of their most prominent characters. And an eyewitness account written on the day of the event has Joseph Smith comparing the characters in the two sources, finding a match, and enables him to decipher at least one of the characters. So a larger conclusion that we can draw is that we've got both a smoking gun, the GAEL that he uses to translate, and we've got an eyewitness. We know how exactly how Joseph Smith attempted to translate from the Kinderhook plates and obtain the content that Clayton says he did. And a larger conclusion then that we can draw is that Joseph Smith translated from the Kinderhook plates not by revelation, but by non-revelatory means. And so, while we have James D. Bales saying only a bogus prophet translates bogus plates, we've got Joseph Smith saying prophet is only a prophet when he's acting as such. And when a prophet is just comparing characters in two documents, he's not acting as such. Thank you. So someone asked, is there any chance that some authentic Kinderhook plates were replaced with forgeries? So I imagine that the question then is aimed at the questioner is wondering, is this plate that was tested not really one of the original Kinderhook plates, but is it like a forgery? Is it a forgery like the ones that Mark back here made? I see him now. I would seriously doubt it. I mean, when you ask a question in the form of, is there any chance that, usually there is some chance of just about anything. The plate, I haven't studied the provenance of it, like how much the Chicago Historical Society can track. Here's how we got it. Here's how long we've had it. But I don't see any reason to think that it was a forgery. Was the skeleton found in the mound also a hoax? Was anything else found other than the plates? So Pratt says that there was a vase found with bones in it. There are various reports around the time that talk about a skeleton. Wilbur Fugit, when he gives his affidavit, he says that there was no skeleton. And there were enough people at the time saying that there were bones that I don't really know fully what to make of that. Sometimes people, when large bones were found, people would assume that they were human bones, sometimes when they were not, and they would infer the size of the person based on a single bone. Like if they thought that it was a leg bone, thigh bone, then they would say, well, if the thigh bone's that big, then the guy must have been that big, and so you end up with these 9 feet tall guys. In this letter from a Gentile, he says that there was an 8.5-foot skeleton, so he's hearing a very similar thing. Mark would actually probably know more about that particular question than I would. So please tell us a little more about your forthcoming Book of Lehi book, gladly. So the first section of that book will deal with the history of the lost 116 pages. What do we know about their translation, like how they were translated, Searstone interpreters? How did Martin Harris end up taking them? Thank you. How did Martin Harris end up taking them home with him? Why was he so persistent? We can actually give really good answers to the question of why he was so persistent at that. Who was likely involved in taking them? There are Lucy Harris, Martin's wife, is the only person who's been pointed to in that regard. There are some reasons to doubt that, and there are some other really good candidates, and none of them have been looked at before. Second section of the book will deal with what we can know of the content of the lost 116 pages. There are several sources on that haven't been used before, and there's a ton of evidence in the text that we've got, the small plates text, and then Mormon's later abridgment. Thank you. Okay, I'm getting plenty of questions here. What about last year's discovery that the alphabet and grammar was an early Mormon cipher? Why would Joseph use that to translate? So I was here last year for that presentation, Will's presentation. I do think that that's not an area of my expertise, and it's a really complex and hairy topic. it does appear to me to have elements of cipher in it, and so I think that the alphabet and grammar materials are very complex and that they have multiple functions and should be understood in multiple ways. So while I think it has cipher elements, I think it probably has other elements too. I don't know, this will be maybe a good, this kind of question will maybe be a good one for future further discussion. Just as critics speculate that there might be a second Spalding manuscript that more closely matches the Book of Mormon, can we speculate that there might be a second original set of Kinderhook plates that were engraved? And then there's a smiley face. Sure. I take it that it's a joke. So I don't know. I found it interesting that Joseph translated the boat-like character with a word ending in hoiupa, which I believe has been pointed out by Stephen Ricks, means water. Could you comment on that? Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I was also told by someone at the Joseph Smith papers, it was Andy, is it Hedges? He knows Egyptian. Huh? Hedges, okay. There's the voice of Mark has spoken. But thank you. He also had said something, he pointed out another match between, I can't remember, maybe I'll think of it in a minute. He pointed out another match with the Egyptian there. Do you think Clayton misunderstood Joseph as translating when the prophet was merely drawing attention to a similarity between two characters, or do you think there was an actual attempt at translation? I think this was the attempt at translation, so to speak. And I think, whether we call it translation or not, I don't know how much it matters. Joseph's making a comparison. He sees that there's a match. I suspect that it's a really offhand kind of thing, just because of the ease with which it could have happened. Here you take one of the most prominent characters, perhaps the most prominent, from the top of one of the plates. You turn a whole whopping 2 pages into the characters in the GAEL, and you find a match. That's all he would have needed to do. Joseph doesn't purchase the plates, and so he doesn't seem to have any intention of doing like a full translation. This may be difficult to read here. I may need to do some deciphering of my own. Is there any documentation in Joseph's own words, anything about the Kinderhook plates? So I can't remember if we've got direct statements from him about the finding or display. We've got, in any case where we have Joseph's words reported, unless we've got his spoken words reported, there's always someone reporting them, there's someone recording them. And some of our sermons that we have reported from Joseph Smith that we quote were taken, what we have is taken from notes that were written by William Clayton and others. And so if Clayton writes in his journal that Joseph says such and such, then that's as good a source as we've got for any of the words that he's speaking. If the plates were written and made to embarrass Joseph and the church, why did the creators of the plates wait until 1879 to reveal the conspiracy? I don't know why Fugate waited. He didn't say anything about it until he was asked, so it seems like for him this was long in the past. I don't believe, although it's been claimed and it's in the current Wikipedia article, which needs editing, the current Wikipedia article claims that the plates were made to put Joseph to the test and embarrass him, when in fact Fugate says in 2 different letters that they were simply a joke, and he doesn't, from what he says, it was a joke on the local Mormons. There was no intention of sending them off to Nauvoo. Okay. This is from Mark. Thank you. Mark informs me that the Chicago plate that's been tested is the same size as the tracings in William Clayton's journal, and also, I guess, a tracing in Brigham Young's journal, which would strongly indicate that it's not a forgery, that we're dealing with the one of the original plates. So were the forgers, or one of them, familiar with the GAEL characters and therefore an insider? I don't think so at all. I think if you're making up hundreds of characters like they do for the Kinderhook plates, or just getting characters from somewhere, there's going to be some match with another large set of characters, especially if you have a system where you take these characters and you can break them down into still more characters. List some of your other publications or published papers, please, shamelessly. I think I may know who wrote this, but yeah, I think it could be the editor of a certain volume, I don't know, that I published in. In the the John Whitmer Historical Association has a series, The Persistence of Polygamy, which will be 3 volumes when it's done. The first volume has to do with Joseph Smith and polygamy, and the first chapter in that volume is mine on whether there was pre-Nauvoo polygamy, looking in particular at Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger to ask, was that polygamy? I published a couple essays in Sunstone, most recently on the translation method used for the Book of Mormon, which will also be covered in my forthcoming book on the 116 pages. And several years ago, I had published one in Sunstone called The Grand Fundamental Principles of Mormonism, Joseph Smith's Unfinished Reformation, which looked at some of Joseph's sermons right around this same time, just 2 months later, where he spelled out what he said were these foundational principles of the faith, the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism, which we don't seem to talk about a whole lot, even though they're just absolutely incredible. How long were the Kinderhook plates on display at the prophet's house? Where did they go next? And did it seem trivial to the prophet? Here again is something where, I've looked at things on this. It's been a while. I would suspect that Mark would have this kind of information more at his fingertips or near the forefront of his mind. I know it was at least a matter of weeks, and then they were taken, the people who had created them had them taken or sent to certain like historical and antiquarian societies to be looked at. And yeah, I don't remember too much of the detail on that. But that looks like the last question, so thank you very much. Actually, sorry, even though I concluded, there's one thing I just thought of, I remembered having on here. I think the Kinderhook Plates is a good example of this idea that was Christine Hagelin, who's the editor of Dialogue, gave a lecture one time where she used a paraphrase from her dad that seemed to me very pertinent to this. Said, the way to deal with troubling knowledge is not to know less, but to learn more. So like with the Clayton journal entry about the Kinderhook plates, this isn't something that we have ever needed to be afraid of or, kind of brush aside. We need only to learn more about it. And I think there are so many problems that we encounter in doing Mormon history and scripture studies where really this is the answer. We just need to learn more. So thank you again.